So I got sober when I was 19, and the sort of maxim was that you were kind of given this gift, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I always felt that I was saved, right? That I was 19 and I was saved. And so part of that is that you're dependent on using that for the good. So I feel, and it's not that I'm a saint by any stretch of the imagination. I'm going on vacation in 2 days, but I just feel that I have this opportunity now to highlight people who might not otherwise be highlighted.
Let's talk about your family, and I want to go back a bit. Your mother is arguably one of, along with perhaps only Gloria Steinem, two of the most important feminists of our lifetimes and before our lifetimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about it, Gloria Steinem was, is really an activist and really did want that role. Whereas my mom is really a poet and an academic, and then she had this book that placed her in the pantheon and was able to sort of parlay that into a second wave feminism career. She became a feminist icon. I do not think that she was either equipped or particularly wanted to be that. But I think that for my mom, I don't know that it was necessarily the job I think she thought she wanted it, because I think that I don't know that this is true for everyone, but I think for her, and certainly for my grandfather Howard Fast, this was true, that once they got famous, they just didn't want it to ever end.
You grew up around fame.
Yeah.
Seeing it both in your mother accidentally and in your grandfather Howard Fast, who wrote a novel that he had to self-publish.
Yeah.
In order to get out into the world.
So my grandfather is an interesting story because, my grandfather had a pathological obsession with work that I relate to. I wowould sleep over at their house and you would get up and it would be 5:30 in the morning. You hear the typewriter going, 5 a.m. He'd be, and you'd think, like, what is he doing? He's 81 and he's out there, and like he would write a book a year. He would write 2 books a year. By the time he died, he had 60, 70 published books. I mean, just a completely crazy. And he also wrote a column, and he wrote newspaper columns, and he wrote scripts, and he wrote movies, and he wrote books. So what I would say about my grandfather was he had this pathological desire to work. And part of it was because he grew up really poor, and his mother died when he was young, and he felt he would never be okay. And I really relate to him in some ways more than her, because he was just he just wanted to survive. And the way he felt he could survive was through his work. And he didn't have the same he was self-destructive and he was lazy in certain ways as he got older, but he wasn't self-destructive in the way my mom was self-destructive. He really just wanted to work. I would say the other thing about my grandfather, which is pretty interesting, is that he was a communist, and he didn't sort of what happened with McCarthy, where he ended up in jail and he ended up refusing to name names. He didn't seek that out.
Did he talk to you about the experience of going through McCarthyism and specifically about writing Spartacus?
Yes, he did. And he was very mad about Spartacus. He was very mad at Kirk Douglas. It was very hard for him not to be the most famous person. And he was very tormented by the idea that there were movie stars who were on the screen and not behind it. I mean, I think that for him, he really lacked humility. And so the idea that someone else could get famous saying his words just drove him up the wall. It's such a weird peccadillo. Years later, I think about, you never hear any writer complain that somehow the actors are getting credit for his words, but he was furious. And he always felt that the actors get credit for his work, which doesn't even make any sense. But yeah, so Howard Fast had an incredible ego and was a total egomaniac. But he was also, I don't know, he did the right thing when it was a moment to do the right thing. And a lot of people did not do the right thing.
And by that you mean?
He refused to name names. He refused to cooperate with the committee. And he went to jail. And in fact, he writes in Being Read about how he went in to testify, and then they basically just sent him to jail. Like there was no chances, there were no appeals. He literally just went to jail. He really did have beliefs and courage and bravery, and he really did protect those people because he believed in it, and he believed in the people.
What so impressed me about your grandfather was that when he couldn't get the book published, he published it himself.
Oh yeah, grandfather.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so my grandfather Howard Fast was not. He just did stuff. You know, he just didn't care. And I was going to curse, but I'm not cursing because I know we're very genteel here. One of the interesting stories, which I think is relevant and important, is that my grandmother came from quite a wealthy family. And they were the Hudson News family. And her father was a connected guy. And so Jewish, but connected. And in this very rough newspaper business. But that made my grandfather able to do certain things that he would not have been able to do. So she could live in Teaneck. Her father had some money. There was a sort of backstop, which I think, when we're talking about equity, we're never sort of honest, right? When you think about this sort of billionaires and millionaires, you never think about they actually had very upper middle class upbringings, and their parents were able to give them a couple $100,000 to start their business. So I just want to say that my grandmother was very crucial in my grandfather's being able to survive during that period, because remember, he couldn't write, he couldn't make money. They lived in Teaneck right next to her father. People would throw stones at their window. And my grandmother was scared, but she was also protected by her father. So I do think that's a really important thing that people never talk about, is this idea that there was actually a certain safety net. That said, when he got out of jail, he was so incredibly freaked out by the experience, especially as someone who had been, I think the idea that you could be jailed for writing something or having ideas or being not popular with what the government wanted was so scary to him that when they got out, they went to Mexico, because that was the only place you could go where you did not if you did not have a passport. So they went to Mexico, and they were in Mexico for a while, and there was this certain feeling that they could never be safe. And I do think, even though my grandfather went on to write many, many books and win an Emmy and do a lot of television, I do think he never got over being jailed for refusing. I mean, being jailed for contempt of Congress, that is just not something that should happen. There's almost no one has ever been jailed for that.
It certainly doesn't happen anymore, even
right.
when
there's real contempt of Congress.
So let me ask you, though, you have this heritage that takes us back to a time when you could be jailed for speaking out.
Yeah.
And McCarthyism, fueled by Roy Cohn. Do you see a through line that informs you?
Yeah. I actually was thinking about this when we were talking about it just a minute ago. We were talking about my grandfather Howard Fast going to jail during the House on Un-American Activities for being in contempt of Congress. And I wondered, I always have in the back of my mind, what happens if Trump gets reelected? And I wondered if maybe I would end up in jail if Trump got reelected.
And you've written about not just Trump, but Trumpism.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's not one man, McCarthyism became a concept.
Right.
Do you see the parallels now going back to the 50s? Do you see them come?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Trump is just cheap McCarthy, but even tackier. I mean, it's, Trump, I mean, you listen to him, he's George Wallace, he's Nixon, he's Spiro Agnew. I mean, Trumpism is nothing new. It's just that no one in the Republican Party had the lack of historical knowledge and the willingness to touch the fourth rail until Trump came along. Before that, you had people like Paul Ryan saying things like that were evocative of that time, but not all in. It wasn't until Trump that you really had someone who did not understand history and did not understand the larger implications of what he was saying. Jay Perini wrote Gore Vidal's biography, and I am struck by his writing. I think about Gore all the time. I read him, and I think about him because he talks a lot about the United States of amnesia and how hard it is for Americans to learn from history and to remember history. And I think about that all the time because even, from election to election, we lose things we've learned, and even, the difference between, 2 elections ago and now. And there were so many lessons with Trumpism that we learned briefly and then forgot. So the United States of amnesia really speaks to me.
Well, let me ask you about being present, because that really does seem to inform how you view both the world outside and your own life. Your ability to be in the moment, to be present right now, but present every day, has come from those lessons you learned.
Yeah, I mean, I came from a very chaotic childhood. My parents got divorced when I was 3. They were very mad at each other for about a decade. And so I had, sort of very destabilized upbringing. And I got sober when I was 19. I got married when I was 23. And I had my first kid at 24. And he's now 19. And then I have another 2 who are 15. And I would say that, I came from a very disjointed and I needed stability. And so I was able to sort of find that for myself.
One of the things I've been so struck by is your writing that's been informed by your sobriety, because it seems to inform almost every aspect of your life.
I came from a family that was riddled with alcoholism, and my mother had struggled with alcoholism, and my grandmother struggled with alcoholism. They did my mother and father did quite a lot of drugs, smoked quite a lot of marijuana, and, lived next door to a rock band on the Pacific Coast Highway. So it was very much, of the time. I got sober when I was 19. And it informed almost everything about me. And I've been sober for almost 26 years. And, I would not have any of the material possessions, but more than that is sort of the ability to stay present and, be able to do what I do for a living if I were not sober.
Thinking about what you hope you can do, not your mother, not your grandfather, what do you look forward to accomplishing?
I want to use my privilege to help other people and to, especially with the podcast, I get to do that all the time, to talk about ballot initiatives in Ohio and to highlight activists in Texas and help the Cherokee Nation get a congressional seat. I've had so much privilege in my life. And it's funny because my husband, too, grew up very privileged. And, we both really committed ourselves to trying to use that privilege to elevate others. And that is what gets me out of bed in the morning. I love to write, and I'm delighted that I get to write.
So you're at your typewriter at 5:30 in the morning, like your grandfather.
Yes. I'm not as focused as he is, but I'm also not as narcissistic as he is. So it's a trade-off. But I really like working. I love what I get to do. I'm so, the other thing is that I remember I had a career when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and then I didn't have a career for like about 10 years. So I was able to come back by, writing for the Jewish Daily Forward. That's how I rebuilt my career. And I wrote these columns every week, and some were good and some were not as good. And I sort of rebuilt my career. So at 44, I feel incredibly grateful that I get to have another whack at the apple. I just feel that I have this opportunity now to highlight people who might not otherwise be highlighted. And so I feel very lucky to get to do it. And
more than that, though, you have now a 19-year-old and two 15-year-olds.
Yeah.
How does being a parent inform you, and what do you see from them as they look toward the future? What are you looking for them, and what do you see from them?
I mean, one of the great things that my mother taught me, and she was very complicated mother, but one of the amazing things she taught me was she said, just do it, right? Like, just write the book. So I wrote my first book at 19, and I never felt, it was naive, but it was also, I just never felt that I couldn't. And so I think what I've done with my kids is I've said, just do it. Don't, what my older kid has written for a ton of publications, and my younger kids. And, I've just said, like, you can do, there's no reason why you can't do, I'm here to empower you. But, I'm not just here to empower my kids. I'm also here to empower my listeners and my readers. And the goal here is to get people doing what, we're in such a precarious political state that we need people to be,
Are you hopeful?
I am, I'm hopeful. I think people are largely good. And I think that, American politics ebbs and flows, but, even at our worst, this most recent round, we weren't nearly as bad as we might have been and could have been and have been historically. So I think we're getting better. I think the trend line is up.